All right, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into Kant, specifically section 2 of his Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals.
Yeah, this section, it's like he's going beyond just laying the groundwork. He really starts to kind of like pick apart the foundations of how most people think about morality.
So is he sort of saying, hold on, before we jump into right and wrong, we need to figure out how we even get to those idea?
Exactly. He's particularly skeptical of what he calls popular moral philosophy, which is basically, morality based on gut feelings or what's going to happen or just personal preference. And he thinks that's a pretty shaky foundation. Like, imagine trying to build a house on a pile of marshmallows. It's not going to last.
Okay, I like that marshmallow analogy. So is he saying that, like, when people say lying is wrong because you'll get caught or helping others is good because it makes you feel good, that's not really a strong basis for morality?
Right, those justifications, they just aren't dependable or consistent. Like, your morality shouldn't change based on whether you think you can get away with something or how it makes you feel at the moment.
So he's not just looking for good morals, he's looking for a good thought process behind our morals.
Yes, he wants a system that's rooted in pure reason, something that's universal, unchanging, and applies to absolutely everyone, regardless of their emotions or what they personally might gain or lose.
It's like he's really flipping the shift on how we think about morality. How does this compare to other approaches like utilitarianism, where the focus is on maximizing happiness for the most people?
Well, that's a great point, and it's a big difference. Kant would absolutely reject utilitarianism because he argues that focusing only on the consequences, even if it means more happiness for some people, could lead to some pretty bad outcomes. Like, what if getting the most happiness for the most people means ignoring the rights of a smaller group?
So even if most people benefit, if even one person's basic dignity is violated, Kant would say it's morally wrong.
Absolutely. You can't justify immoral actions, even for something that seems like a greater good. The ends don't justify the means if those means violate someone's inherent dignity.
Now, we talked about the categorical imperative before, but I have a feeling it's going to play a much bigger role here.
Oh, you're definitely right about that. The categorical imperative is like the cornerstone of everything in Kant's moral philosophy. It's the test to see if an action is truly moral. And in section 2, he really gets into it, giving us different ways of looking at this core concept.
One of those that really struck me was the idea of treating humanity as an end of itself. What does that really mean? How does that play out in real life?
Basically, it means recognizing the inherent worth and dignity in every single person, not just as a way to get something, but as an end goal in themselves. You respect them not because of what they can do for you or society, but simply because they're human beings who are capable of reason.
So, like, if I ask a friend to help me move, it shouldn't just be about bribing them with pizza and beer.
Well, pizza and beer are never bad, but yeah, you're getting the idea. It's about respecting their right to say no. It's recognizing that their time and energy are theirs to give freely. It's valuing their friendship and their autonomy, not just their ability to lift heavy things.
So it's about seeing their inherent value as a person, not just what they can do for me.
Exactly. It's a big shift in perspective, how we view and interact with others.
This seems pretty different from, like, Aristotle's idea of virtue ethics, which focuses on developing good character traits.
That's a good observation. Aristotle would certainly value friendship and helping others, but his focus is on building virtues, like being generous, kind, and brave. It's about becoming a good person. But Kant prioritizes sticking to these universal moral principles no matter your individual character.
So for Kant, it's not about being a virtuous person. It's about doing the right thing just because it is the right thing, according to reason.
You got it. It's about aligning your actions with what reason says is morally right, even if it clashes with what you want, what you're used to, or what society expects.
Now, another thing that I thought was really interesting was the kingdom of ends. This idea of, like, a perfect society where everyone follows the categorical imperative.
Yeah, it's like this philosophical utopia where everybody treats each other with respect, where actions are guided by reason and moral law. Imagine a society with laws based on pure reason, where everyone's worth is recognized.
It's like a blueprint for a just and ethical society where everything is based on duty and respect, not selfishness. But this kingdom of ends, it doesn't actually exist, right? It seems pretty idealistic given how complicated the world really is.
You're right, it's an ideal. Even Kant admitted that. But, and this is important, it acts as a guiding principle, a compass to help us through all the messiness of real-life choices. It's like the North Star, something to aim for, even if we might never totally reach it.
So it's not about thinking we can create a perfect world. It's about using this idea to guide our actions and make things better.
Exactly. It reminds us that our actions should be consistent with a world where reason and morality win out.
This is the opposite of someone like Thomas Hobbes, who thought that without a strong ruler, things would descend into chaos and violence, with people only acting morally out of fear of punishment.
Yeah, Hobbes had a pretty bleak view of human nature. Kant, on the other hand, is more optimistic. He believes in the power of reason to guide us towards moral behavior, not out of fear, but because it's our duty and we respect the moral law.
So it's not about just avoiding getting punished, it's about doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly. And that leads us to another really important part of Kant's philosophy, which is his take on freedom.
But before we get into that, maybe this is a good time to pause and let our listeners process all these Kantian concepts. We've covered a lot: his critique of popular morality, the importance of the categorical imperative, the idea of humanity as an end in itself, and this kingdom of ends.
Yeah, that's a lot to ponder, but there's more to come. We'll be back soon to explore Kant's views on freedom and how it fits into his whole moral philosophy. Stay tuned.
Okay, so we're back and we're ready to dig into more of Kant's groundwork, specifically section 2, where he really challenges us to think differently about morality.
Right, and last time we kind of left off talking about Kant's pretty unique view on freedom, which you probably guessed isn't exactly what we usually think of when we hear that word.
Yeah, when I hear freedom, I think of, doing whatever I want, like what I eat for dinner or being able to travel wherever.
That's like what we might call freedom of choice, and it's part of it, but Kant says there's a deeper kind of freedom. He calls it autonomy.
Autonomy. Okay, that sounds a little more complicated. Can you break that down a bit?
Okay, imagine this. You're craving those salty chips, even though you know they're not the best for you. But you eat the whole bag anyway. Are you really free in that moment?
I see where you're going with this. I'm kind of letting my craving control me, even when I know it's maybe not the best choice. So I'm not totally in control, even though I could choose not to eat them.
Exactly. You're being driven by your desires, not acting autonomously. For Kant, true freedom, this autonomy, it's about making choices based on reason, not just giving in to what we want in the moment. It's about being in charge of your actions, not a slave to cravings or what other people want you to do.
So real freedom isn't just about having options. It's about making choices based on reason, even if they're not what we'd immediately want.
Exactly. And remember that moral compass we talked about, the categorical imperative. Well, for Kant, aligning your actions with that moral law, that's where you find real children. It's about choosing actions that respect everyone's inherent worth, including your own, not just actions that satisfy your immediate wants.
So even though it might feel like restricting myself by following the moral law, I'm actually becoming more free by choosing to act based on reason. It's like choosing to be guided by a higher principle.
Right? It's a bit of a paradox, but that's Kant for you. It's about challenging ourselves to think differently about who we are and what freedom means. Real freedom isn't about having no limits. It's about being able to choose what's right, even when things are tempting or tough.
This totally changes how I think about freedom. It's not just about having choices, but about how we make those choices and why. It's about aligning my actions with morals that respect everyone.
And that's where freedom and morality really connect in Kant's view. When we choose to act morally, we're not just doing good, we're showing our true freedom as rational beings who can rise above our impulses.
This is a lot to think about, but I'm starting to see how Kant's idea of freedom challenges us to be more aware and intentional in our actions. It's about taking responsibility for our choices and recognizing that we have the power to act based on reason.
It definitely takes self-control and commitment to reason, but for Kant, the rewards in terms of moral growth and personal freedom are huge.
So if I'm getting this right, Kant rejects popular morality because it relies on feelings and circumstances instead of solid reasoning. And instead, he offers the categorical imperative as this universal moral law, a standard for everyone.
You're on the right track. And to finish the picture, he says real freedom comes from choosing to act according to this moral law, even when it's hard or goes against what we immediately feel like doing.
It's all super fascinating, but it brings up a big question. How do we actually live by these principles in the real world? I mean, the kingdom of ends sounds amazing, but people are motivated by all sorts of things, not just pure reason.
That's the million-dollar question, right? How do we take these big philosophical ideas and make them work in real life? Kant thought about this a lot. He knew that the world is messy and people aren't perfectly rational, but he still thought we should aim for a more rational and moral society, even if we know we'll never fully get there.
It's like aiming for a target, knowing you won't always hit the bullseye, but still, aiming helps you move in the right direction.
Exactly. It's about setting a high standard for ourselves, even though we know we won't always meet it. It's about believing that we can grow morally and that aiming for that growth is what makes us truly free.
This whole idea of autonomy and acting on reason is really making me think about how I make choices. But honestly, it's a bit daunting. How do we know what reason says to do in every situation? life is full of gray areas.
You're right. Kant's not giving us a rule book. It's more like a framework for moral thinking, a way to think about our choices and how they affect everyone. It takes careful thought, self-reflection, and being willing to question our own biases.
So it's not about finding a perfect answer every time. It's more about really thinking things through, considering the moral principles, and trying our best to make choices that fit with the categorical imperative.
Precisely. It's about being aware of our choices, thinking about the consequences for everyone, and striving to do what respects everyone's worth. It's a process of learning and growing.
This conversation has really made me think harder about how I make decisions. It's like Kant is pushing us to be more mindful, more thoughtful, and more rational in our everyday choices.
That's a great way to put it. He wants us to rise above our instincts and really live up to our potential as rational, moral beings.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also really inspiring. It's like he's saying that we have this amazing capacity for reason, and by using it to guide our actions, we can become more ethical people and contribute to a more just world.
You've hit on something important. Kant believed that reason wasn't just for gaining knowledge, it was for living a moral life. For him, true enlightenment wasn't just about knowing more, it was about being a better person.
So it's about using our reason to make choices that are good for us and good for the world. It's realizing we're not just individuals, but part of something bigger.
Exactly. And for Kant, that ability to act morally, to make choices based on reason and the categorical imperative, that's what makes us truly free. It's about being self-governing and respecting the dignity of all humans.
Now, you mentioned the will being like this self-governing faculty. Can you explain what Kant meant by that and how it connects to freedom?
Great question. Kant's idea of the will as self-governing is key to his idea of autonomy. It means we have the ability to make our own rules, to decide what we do based on reason, not just external pressures or internal impulses.
So instead of just reacting to the world or being driven by what we want, we can choose our own principles and act on them, like we have this internal moral compass.
Perfect analogy. And that ability to govern ourselves, to act autonomously, that's true freedom. We're not just puppets or slaves to our passions. We can determine our own lives, make choices based on what's right, not just what we feel like doing.
This really makes me think about moral responsibility in a new way. It's not about blindly following rules. It's about using reason to figure out what's right and then choosing to act accordingly.
Exactly. It's a much more active and powerful view of morality. We're not just following a script, we're part of creating and upholding the moral code. And that's huge because it means we each have the power to make the world a better place.
It's challenging but also incredibly inspiring. It's like Kant is calling on us to be moral agents, not just subjects. He's asking us to own our moral choices and be the ones who create ethical lives.
Beautifully put. And I think that message is even more relevant today when we're constantly bombarded with information and facing tough ethical questions. Kant's philosophy gives us a way to handle those questions and make choices based on reason and respect for everyone's worth.
Now, I'm curious how all this connects to Kant's bigger picture of enlightenment. He was a big figure in the Enlightenment, this period that really emphasized reason, individual freedom, and progress.
That's a great connection. Kant's philosophy is deeply tied to the ideals of the Enlightenment. For him, true enlightenment wasn't just about gaining knowledge, it was about using our reason to become more ethical and independent people.
So for Kant, enlightenment was about more than just intellectual growth. It was about moral and ethical growth, too. It's about being self-governing, guided by reason, and respecting everyone's dignity. It's about using our reason to build a better world.
You nailed it. For Kant, freedom wasn't just a political or social idea. It was fundamental to both our minds and our morals. It was the basis for a life lived by reason and in respect for humanity.
This has been such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. We've only just touched on Kant's ideas about freedom and autonomy, but it's already shifted how I see things.
You're right, there's always more to explore with Kant, but I think we've covered some key points from Section 2. Maybe it's a good spot to give our listeners a chance to process all these philosophical ideas.
Agreed. We've given everyone a lot to chew on. But don't worry, we'll be back to wrap up Section 2 with a final look at Kant's arguments and some thoughts on how to apply these ideas in real life.
Until then, keep thinking.
All right, welcome back to the show. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Section 2 of Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals.
Yeah, it's been a pretty intense journey exploring the twists and turns of Kant's moral philosophy.
Definitely. We've gone from his critique of popular morality to his focus on the categorical imperative, and then to his ideas about humanity as an end in itself, the kingdom of ends, and this whole concept of freedom as autonomy.
And I think now's the time to try and bring it all together to see the bigger picture of what Kant's trying to do with this moral revolution.
So what's the key takeaway? What's the heart of his argument in Section 2?
I think Kant's calling for a total shift in how we think about morality. He wants us to move away from basing our judgments on subjective feelings or what we personally prefer, or even just the consequences.
That's like he's saying, don't just tell me what feels good or bad. Give me the reasoning, the universal principles behind what you think.
Exactly. He wants us to back up our actions not just with emotions or beliefs, but by showing they align with universal moral principles, principles that any rational being could apply.
And that's where the categorical imperative comes in, right? It's the test for whether something is truly morally right.
You got it. The categorical imperative, in all its different forms, gives us a framework for figuring out what's moral. And it goes beyond individual whims, cultural norms, or specific situations. It's about acting in a way that could be a universal rule, treating everyone with respect, and recognizing everyone's inherent worth.
So instead of asking, what will make me happy or what's best for me, Kant's saying we should ask, what's the right thing to do no matter what I want or what might happen?
Exactly. It's a shift from a focus on ourselves to a focus on principles. It's recognizing that we have duties to ourselves and others because we can reason and are part of a moral community.
And this connects back to his view of freedom, doesn't it? True freedom isn't about doing whatever we want, but choosing to act based on reason and moral law.
Absolutely. For Kant, autonomy, that ability to act based on reason, that's true freedom. It's about freeing ourselves from being controlled by our desires and being rational beings who can decide for ourselves.
So even when it's tough, when we choose to align our actions with the moral law, we're actually being more free and fulfilling our potential as moral beings.
It's a deep idea. It might seem counterintuitive, but that's what's so great about Kant. He makes us question our usual assumptions about freedom and morality.
It's definitely a new way of thinking about things. It's a lot to absorb, but it also feels empowering in a way. It means we have the power to shape our own moral lives and contribute to a more ethical world.
It is empowering. It's a call to action to be more aware, thoughtful, and rational in how we make decisions. It's about recognizing we're not just along for the ride, we can actively make a difference.
But how do we actually live by these principles every day? The kingdom of ends is a great concept, but the world's not perfect.
That's the real challenge, right? Bridging the gap between the ideal and reality. Kant understood this. He wasn't trying to give us rules for every situation. It's more about having a framework for moral reasoning, a way to approach ethical problems with careful thought, and a commitment to these universal principles.
So it's about developing a way to thinking, considering how our choices affect us and others. It's not just about what do I want, but what is the right thing to do?
Exactly. It's about constantly reflecting, examining our motives, and trying to make our actions match those principles of reason, respect, and making choices that could apply to everyone.
This deep dive into Kant has been eye-opening. It feels like we've only just begun to explore his ideas, but it's already changed how I understand morality, freedom, and how I can play a part in making the world more ethical.
And as we wrap up our look at Section 2, I hope you, dear listeners, take these Kantian ideas with you. Remember to think for yourself, act based on reason, and always treat everyone, including yourself, as an end in themselves and never just a means to an end.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into Kant. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.